Good afternoon, everyone. We will give everyone a few more minutes to log on, and then we will get started with our event. Thank you all so much for being here today. Okay, good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us for our July Race and Education webinar focused on providing support for BIPOC students in foster care. We chose this topic in recognition of BIPOC Mental Health Month, and so it's a time for us to acknowledge families and professionals who help support students with experience in foster care and advocate for mental health resources for Black, Indigenous, people of color. The Hunt Institute is committed to having honest conversations about issues of race that are embedded in and impact all of our public education. Our Race and Education webinar series is an opportunity to lift up the voices of people and organizations who have dedicated their time and resources to improving outcomes for children of color. The Child Welfare website states that there are over 400,000 children and youth in foster care, and 34% were placed with relatives or family. When children cannot remain safely in their home, placement with relatives and family, both formally and through the child welfare system and informally through family arrangements, can increase stability, reduce trauma, and help children maintain a sense of family, belonging, and identity. Investing in culturally appropriate services and supports for relative and caregivers may help reinforce a child's cultural identity and traditions. Their parents or primary caregivers can instill or would have instilled despite circumstances. So today we're joined by three leaders who have years of experience in supporting students and children with foster care and mental health resources. I'd love for each of you to introduce yourselves, your name, and why this work is important to you. First, we'll start with Christine.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Christine Frederick. I'm the CEO of the Flight Center here in Broward County. I've been working with youth in foster care for just about 20 years now. I mean, this work is important to me for a multitude of reasons other than myself being part of the Hispanic community, but just knowing the battles and the struggles, challenges that our youth in foster care are facing. We're here in South Florida. The majority of our youth in care here in South Florida come from the Black and Brown community. And so really being able to move them from survival to thriving is what our goal has been. We've really tried to change the narrative that surviving is enough. It needs to be more than surviving. We need to get them to a point where they're thriving. And we know that we can only do that through education and creating opportunities for our young people to be able to provide for themselves, moving forward into their future.
Thank you. Next, we'll have Orlando introduce himself.
Good afternoon. My name is Orlando Bullock. I'm a school social worker, and I'm also on the National Association of Social Workers on the national level as well as the state level here in North Carolina. And this work is important in my job because the numbers are increasing and the foster care placements are decreasing. And so we're having a harder time to place kids. And so they're having to be placed further and further out when kinship care is not available. and things like that. And it's even more difficult when there's a therapeutic setting that needs to be found for placement. And so we're finding that kids are having to be moved to further distances away just to find a placement. And so we try to maintain some stability. And as a school social worker, a lot of times school is the only stability in the process when kids are transitioning from home into foster placements. And so we try our best to navigate that so the students can have some stability in all of the changes that they have to experience when they first go into foster and while they're in foster, because as we know, a lot of times they have to do changes in foster placement for various reasons.
Great, thank you. And our final panelist, Latasha.
Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to start by saying thank you, Dr. Canty, for inviting me to be a part of this discussion today on race, mental health within the educational system. So a little bit about me. I'm a medical management specialist with Blue Cross Blue Shield of Illinois. I am also a licensed professional counselor with Chicago Healing Connection. In my role as a counselor, I work with young adults and older to manage depression, anxiety, life adjustments, life transitions, and trauma. I also have experience working with children and adolescents and working with their families as well to help them overcome their mental health and the family so that they can have the support system needed to thrive as they are going forward. This work is meaningful to me because mental health is at the core of most of the human problems that are occurring in our world today. By being proactive with our youth, the youth will have a greater chance to live healthy and productive lives in their adulthood, which can decrease of harm to others, oppression, and etc. By being proactive and providing mental health treatment and services, the youth have a positive impact on families, on their community, and the society as a whole.
Thank you, Latasha. And last, I guess myself, I'm Dr. Ashley Canty. I'm the Director of Equity Initiatives at the Hunt Institute, and super excited to engage with our panelists in this conversation as we really think more intentionally about how we provide services and support to young people in our schools. So our first question will go to Christine. How can school leaders and teachers support students who are in foster care or in need of behavioral health resources?
So one of the biggest things that schools can do is really increasing the awareness of the staff surrounding some of the struggles of foster youth. I think that creating a framework where young people are able to have people to go to or pinpoint certain folks that they can go to in the school for additional help and additional resources is important. It's hard enough usually for our young people to feel already like they just kind of walk around already like they feel different, even if we don't see, if you see them from one child to the next, you might not feel like they look different. But our young people feel different oftentimes when they're going into different settings. They feel like they have some form of branding, right? That's like on their forehead that says, you know, I'm in foster care. I don't have, you know, a stable household, or you know, I'm living in a group home, or different things like that. I think that the school system needs to be more educated about that. I think that there's supports and services that need to be built around that. Here at the Flight Center, we're a drop-in center, a one-stop, and all of the things that we've tried to do is really build a network of resources that are available right here for our young people that are responsive to our young people. They don't want to have to explain 50 times over and over again that they're not placed with their family. In doctors' offices, they're asking for family history, and some of our young people might not be connected with their blood relatives to know that family history. The same things happen within the school system, parental consents, and different things like that. So if you're able to create a supportive framework within your school that helps to create some normalcy for our young people, but at the same time acknowledging that they do have some needs that are different, you need to have that. And I think that there needs to be monitoring of them, not in a way that takes it out of normalcy, but we need to be mindful of the fact that our young people in general in this generation are facing so many struggles. There's mental health is so pervasive. Our young people have so much access to information that is sometimes inappropriate, how to harm themselves, to participate in different challenges, different things that they might do to fit in. it's also a platform for bullying that can take place. You know, so there really needs to be an education of the teams, and there needs to be a safety net around our young people in the school system to help them to understand that there are professionals that understand that this population exists within the school system, and that it's okay, that if they didn't have a meal that day, that's something that's being addressed at the forefront, rather than a teacher expecting a young person to come in and learning is at the forefront of their brain. Maybe eating is the first thing that they need to do, you know, when they come in. If they came in late, instead of harping on how they're late and they're going to detention for it, what's going on? You know, was there a struggle with traveling there? These are some of the things that we have set up at our center with our GED program. For example, we address the emergency and immediate need first, because again, unless you're removing that survival piece for a young person to be able to learn to create an environment, not just aesthetically, but an environment within themselves, the mentality of in which they're able to learn and thrive, then you're really doing them, you know, an injustice.
Thank you, Christine. I really love that you focused on kind of meeting those basic needs as we start to think about the intervention methods for students. So whether it's family needs and just some of those things that we sometimes take for granted and don't recognize in our own privilege as we work with those who have different situations or circumstances from our own, being really aware of that.
And these things help, they preclude students from sometimes participating in extracurricular activities. And we have to think beyond the mold of just saying, okay, we can pay for you to participate in this extracurricular activity. We also have to think about the transportation. How will they get to and from? Will there be a parent to be able to bring them home, or is it a group home setting where a car is sent? And so this is why the extracurricular activity is not available. We have to think beyond the bounds of what we're used to thinking of, because there's a lot more struggle surrounding just saying, I'll just pay for this for a young person to attend. Will they be able to be consistent with it? And who will help maintain that, help that youth to maintain that consistency so they're not ripped away from something that they grow to love? What are we able to build around it that is able to help them to be consistent?
Yes, I really do like the notion of creating that consistency, that stability in things that those students and children enjoy. Which leads us to our next question, which will be for Latasha. How can parents and educators advocate for Black, Indigenous, people of color, specifically students, to receive adequate support, such as individual therapy or other mental health interventions, to alleviate some of the barriers that exist?
Yes, so I believe a good start is by understanding how we are lacking policies that are in place and where funds are being allocated. Up to 80% of youth that are living in underserved communities that are Black and Brown are not receiving mental health services within those communities. And that is essentially because the mental health services are inadequate, or the communities are lacking proper resources. So of those students that are receiving mental health services, 70 to 80% of those students are receiving mental health services at their schools. School psychologists, school social workers, and school nurses are frequently the first to see children who are experiencing trauma, stress, sick, hurting themselves or hurting others. These providers are trained to meet the children's mental health needs, their social needs, and their physical needs. It is important to have well-trained, experienced child and adolescent providers who are also culturally competent. According to statistics, the percentage of security guards after the Columbine incident, for example, went up from 54% to 70%. However, on the flip side, school counselors only went up 5%. So with that being identified, I think a good place to start with is for educators and parents to evaluate what is working within the school system and what is not working within the school system. Parents and educators will want to work with the school district officials in implementing the changes needed to support youth in their mental health needs. Educators and parents should become familiar with the political dynamic within the school's community, identifying individuals who would be likely to support or who would be opposed to these changes. Educators and parents will want to develop a strategy on how to approach the policy change to increase mental health services and resources within these schools. It is also important to bring awareness to the community And to the school board, we don't want to assume that individuals are already going to be supportive or they know. I believe that awareness and education is key if we're going to be making changes for mental health and the children that are in need of these services.
Thank you. I really enjoy the fact that we bring into how schools are resourced. Recently, an article came out that talked about teacher retention, and that it's more than just paying people more. It's also thinking about how resourced our schools are with counselors and therapists and nurses to really address some of the concerns that students are having and the trauma that exists well beyond what we can often see, which I believe Christine alluded to as she talked about some of the nuances of how we engage students in creating, a sense of safety, but also a sense of support. Orlando, this question is for you. How can local policymakers and legislators support the work of foster agencies and organizations, specifically as it relates to how social workers engage in schools? What policies are in place that help to support your work or that of the school system in providing resources and support to students? I believe you are on mute.
Sorry. I believe the one policy that jumps out is Essa, which is Every Student Succeeds Act, which is designed to kind of ensure that kids can, when they move around, they can get placement into schools right away, so they don't have a lot of lag time and miss opportunity for classroom instruction. And so they don't have to have the necessary documents always. They just move wherever they move to, and then they're immediately enrolled. But what we find, or what I've found with some of the students that come into our environment, is when you move to a different school and you're not with your family, a lot of times if we're trying to put a support in place, for example, we may put in an individual education plan, better known as an IEP, to support that student where they may have some academic gaps because they've moved around frequently. And so when we try to do that, a lot of times the difficulty is finding the biological parents because they have not given up their parental rights, but they're in foster. And so initially we still have to try to track them down through the foster care social worker to send that invite so they can still participate if they want to. And then once that's done, we also invite the foster parents into the IEP meeting or educational plan meeting, so everyone is aware of what we're trying to put in place, because where we see the deficiencies, whether it be in English or math or some other subject. And then when we have the meeting, we talk about what other needs. So then behaviors may come up. And so then there's an additional step once we've done the IEP portion to go into what we call a 504 or accommodations. And so a child that may have certain behaviors that they're displaying while in the building, we address that in a 504 plan to try to address the behaviors. Is strictly for the behaviors. And so there's different things that we do, but a lot of it comes back to the Essa system or policy. So these kids can get in school right away and we can start addressing some of their needs. And then once they have a school of origin or a school in that county, the first school they attend, and it transitions elementary to middle school to high school. So each time you transition to another educational level, you'll have a school of origin, i.e. when you go to 6th grade, you start your middle school of origin, 9th grade, you start your high school of origin, here in North Carolina, that is. And so once you have that, you can maintain that stability at the school of origin. So even if you move out into another county, if it's within range that transportation can be provided, then we'll still keep you at that school. And so you can have some sense of stability in the midst of all the chaos. And so that's some of the things that we try to do, and the funding is there for it. And just trying to, a lot of times for me, we get notification that a student is coming in. The social worker is the first one that gets that notification. And so then right away, I start working to get that student enrolled, get them connected with services if they had services, if we even aware that they had services previously in another county, or behavior issues that may be coming with them that we can address right away. Until we can have these necessary meetings, we may have to put something temporarily in place so there can be some stability for the child. One of the things we talked about a minute ago was the staff and things that they can do. A lot of times what I try to do as a social worker is buffer that. And so I try to have all the information that's needed on this child. And if it's a new child to our school, I try not to necessarily share that with everyone to protect the child, because I really don't want the child to be treated any different. And, you know, we have our biases about kids in foster care, and someone may feel a certain way. Well, now that they know this child is labeled foster care, now they may treat them differently, like, you know, trying to give them extra time for something when they really may not need it. So just trying to buffer that as much as we can. And then when there is an issue, whether it be with behavior or discipline or coursework or whatever the case, then in the meeting, I will address, well, this student has some other traumas that they're currently going through. And, you know, this may be the reason they're displaying this behavior and things like that. And so, you know, just working with the child and the administration and his teachers as well, and just trying to get everyone to understand, you know, we're here to help this child. And so, you know, getting them in the right placement, putting the proper supports around them, following up on stuff. And when something isn't working, you know, make adjustments to that. And so that's what we try to do.
Thank you so much for that. And really speaking to some of the multi-layered processes that are in place to ensure that students get what they need, but also some of the ways that that process can sometimes not serve students in the work that you all have to do as mental health experts and social workers to compensate and make sure that students are in the right places. This next question is for Orlando and Christine, and we'll start with Christine. As stated earlier, you mentioned about culturally appropriate services to support caregivers, as well as in the intro, I mentioned thinking about children's cultural identity. What types of services and supports can educators from early childhood, even all the way through the end of high school and post-secondary spaces, provide to support children and caregivers in providing culturally appropriate services and culturally preparing those families that may be blended based on culture or identity?
You know, there's no easy answer, but there's places that you can start, right? With a lot of our young people who get placed in care, again, for us at the center, some of the simple things start with food. We have, you know, pantry services, for example, that go out, and we, you know, early on receive feedback from our young people like, the food is great, it's helpful. I want to be able to cook some things that are, you know, traditional within my culture, right? Some of the seasonings, some of the different things. I think that sometimes we can really start at a basic level of, and again, it kind of goes back to those basic needs. Food is a great unifier of people. You know, you sit down and you break bread together and all of those things. So I think that a lot has to go into really making a young person feel connected to who they are, regardless of the fact that they've been disconnected from their families or their past. Those are some of the big things, but I think that conversations with some of the foster families and within the education system need to happen surrounding whatever the largest group is of representation that you have from the BIPOC community, and what that needs to look like for young people. You know, what are some of, we need to ask some of the young people, these are, you know, basic tactics that I think that folks kind of overlook, that are so, they're just so fundamental and basic. If you ask young people, they're very honest. If you ask children, they're super honest, almost brutally honest, sometimes, you know, hurt your feelings honest, right? They will tell you what they feel like they need. We need to make sure that they have access to the things that are important to them. When we've seen blended families, we've done all kinds of things here in our community, from teaching some of those foster parents how to take care of a young person's hair that is different from their hair, the things that are important to our young people, and access to those mechanisms that make them feel part of their cultural community, right? So it might be things that's unfamiliar to that family. And within a blended family, you may have, a family who's not as well versed in the different types of weave and how important that is to a young person, or whether they have certain traditional beliefs, whether they want to lock their hair or they don't, and all these different things. So some of these things really come down to a very basic level. You also have to address things within cultures about belief systems that young people have about receiving assistance, about the trust that they have for different systems, doctors, even receiving healthcare services, the barriers that a lot of our young people face with accessing mental health care and feeling trusting of those things. And for a lot of the folks who are involved, there has to be an honest conversation about why those mistrusts exist. And there has to be a certain form of acceptance of why that exists to begin with. Why is there a mistrust for doctors? And them going to get healthcare. Many times our young people are overlooked, or our Black and Brown community is overlooked with what their needs are, or are given remedies that are not consistent culturally with what they want to see happen for themselves, or their expression of what's going on isn't taken seriously. And as a community, we need to be aware of those things that we've helped to create, right? So part of having cultural awareness is accepting our role in that, accepting what the role that the system has played in creating some of those mistrusting situations. For some families, accepting their privilege and the fact that they, may not ask for these privileges, but they receive them innately, and understanding that those privileges don't necessarily pass down to our young people just because they might be in care with them. So they have to be sensitive to the fact that our Black and Brown community is facing different things in the streets. Even if they're placed with this family and this family is well-intended, there are different things that our young people are going to be facing than what that family themselves have faced experientially. And some of those conversations need to happen. So I think just, again, I bring it back to awareness. I bring it back to a lot of sometimes very basic conversations, and sometimes a lot of really hard conversations, uncomfortable conversations. People have to be willing to have them. We've entered into this place where no one wants to be offended, and it's not about offending anyone, but real conversations need to be able to happen in order for things to be able to change, or for us to create a community of support for our young people. Real conversations, need to take place.
Thank you for your response to that, Orlando.
For me as a social worker, part of our code of ethics is cultural competence. And so we start there with the families that you work with, being competent on certain beliefs and practices and things that they do in their culture. And so trying to teach, whether it be a foster parent that's placed with a family with a child that doesn't look like the foster parent, and to be culturally competent about where this child is coming from, some of the practices in their home, some of the religious beliefs that they have in their culture, things like that. And the same thing happens in the school system. We try to teach about our staff about cultural competence and why a person may be wearing a certain outfit at a certain time of the year, or why a child can't eat during the daytime because of religious beliefs, and now it's time for them to be fasting during the day. And so the teachers are concerned, I haven't seen this student eat anything all week, and now it's Thursday, I don't know what's going on. Normally they eat, a lot at lunch, but they haven't been eating. And then you realize it's a religious holiday and they fast during the daytime, and things like that. So it can be a smoother exposure to this child, that you're not saying, oh my God, what's wrong with you? Why aren't you eating? If you are just aware that it's a religious holiday, and during that religious holiday, they don't eat during daylight hours. So something simple as that, but just allowing the child to be expressive. And also the school, in my case as a school social worker, we pick traditional holidays. Well, everyone may not be celebrating certain holidays. So then we have to find the cultures that we aren't celebrating. If we have a large population of, say, Muslim children, then we have to also find ways to celebrate their cultures, and not just have the Christmas show or the Easter show, or, you know, that the masses are celebrating. We have to also find ways to celebrate the different families that are in our school system, and let them have a program that celebrates their culture so they can be proud of their culture and not try to assimilate to something that's not their normal culture. And so just trying to facilitate that, being aware, being culturally competent, and trying to help families feel value in what they are and where they come from.
Thank you so much for both of your answers. And really thinking about how culture really plays a significant part in like creating family and a sense of belonging, all the way from food to traditions. And even as we think about hair, what that means, especially for children of color, and the importance of that, and the cultural nuances of how that comes up in people's everyday lives. This next question is for Latasha and Orlando. So nationwide, Black youth are overrepresented in foster care. In 2018, Black children represented 14% of the total child population, but 23% of all children in foster care. In comparison, white youth represented 50% of the nation's child population and 44% of its foster care population. What do you feel attributed to these statistics? How can educators and policymakers come together to address this difference or even reduce it? And what impact, if any, does this have on families and children of color?
So I can start. So the information I'm presenting is not inclusive of all the potential factors, but according to a study that was conducted that included child and welfare workers, school personnel were implicated for over-reporting minority children, especially for neglect. It is believed that school personnel will confuse neglect with poverty. Another possible attribution is the role media has played in its effect over representation of minorities in the child and welfare system. Over the years, there have been increased media attention nationwide to extreme cases of abuse and neglect, especially those involving the death of a child. Though it is imperative that workers are properly assessing the children and families, media has left supervisors and workers feeling vulnerable and under increased scrutiny. These feelings of uncertainty often manifest in the workers substantiating more cases, as a result, bringing more children into the system. And I'll stop there.
Well, I will agree with that. Initially, on why some kids end up in the system, I think it's biases that people may have on their reporting of different issues. A teacher may see a bruise on a student and not get the information as to where that bruise came from because they saw it on their neck or on their back, and it's a big bruise. Well, researching that and finding out that they had a fall or they were playing a sport and got injured and things like that. You know, they may not go that deep into it. They may just assume that this child was being abused at home and make a report. So just understanding the reporting process, doing some front load work where you're talking to a student, getting an understanding of this student and what their environment entails. That may be one part. Another part, I think with kids losing housing and ending up in foster, because the economy is what the economy is. And so many Black and brown families are struggling to make ends meet because we are not all thriving economically. And so some families have lost housing. Unfortunately, a family that's trying to survive in a car is not appropriate housing. So the children sometimes are removed from that car or that van because the family is parking at a Walmart parking lot at night. And that's not considered suitable housing for that family, but yet the parent is trying to keep this family together. And so that's a strength of the family by trying to do that. But yet we as the system may say, that's not appropriate for this family, so let's get a better setting. and then you remove them from that environment because there are no affordable houses available. And so I think the difficulties of families going into foster, whether it be due to a trauma, the loss of a parent. I've had that happen where a child lost a parent, which was the only parent they had, and had to be placed because there was no kinship care placement available. They ended up in the system. So it's just different reasons that put them there. But a lot of times the Black and brown kids don't get the same supports prior to being put in in foster, because they may have other avenues available, whether it be kinship care or a family member just taking them in and not having to deal with the system at all. And we may not have that sometime in Black and brown families.
Thank you for that. My next question is for Christine. How has COVID impacted the ability for social workers and advocacy organizations to support families and children in foster care? How has this impacted the access to mental health services, resources, and support?
So a couple of things. I mean, COVID has been tremendously impactful, right, for businesses across the board, and nonprofit is not an exception to that. I think that some supports were able to be, given across governmentally. You had some philanthropists that were very philanthropic and very giving and tried to help keep agencies afloat and moving along. Unfortunately, some of our most grassroots organizations that really work in culturally competent ways with some of our BIPOC communities are the ones who really felt a huge impact because they didn't have these huge budgets, they didn't have these huge reserves, and quite frankly, maybe don't have the same amount of resources available as some more affluent organizations to do fundraising and to have filled in the gaps or come up with other creative type of fundraising ideas through the pandemic, and that's been tremendously impactful. Many workers had to move to, depending on what the status was with their organizations, had to move to remote services, which I think was a good Band-Aid, right? If you weren't able to safely deliver services in person, it was better than losing connection altogether. But the problem is that it's very impersonal, in my opinion, right? This is my professional opinion in working with these young people. It's impersonal. We had, at Flight Center, we had good and bads that came out of it for some young people. For life skills, it was, moving to Zoom was a benefit because they were able to access, much like all of us here are able to be together from all different parts of the country. It was able to give them access to be able to be part of certain things. So we were thinking creatively, but the interpersonal touch, the interpersonal mingling and relationships and camaraderie was gone. I think that what was scary for us was young people and us not being able to see them and put our eyes on them, knowing whether they were eating adequately, other than if we were delivering food and not knowing what was going on in between that time. For some of our younger folks, it was concerns about whether there was abuse going on in the household and that increase of abuse because everyone is now festering within the same house. They're on each other's nerves. Tempers are short. Resources are running out because now you're trying to keep youth fed during the day where normally they're at school. Now they're eating through your whole fridge the whole time. I mean, I experienced this as a parent myself, right? They're just eating you out of house and home. And as a family that may not have the resources available to allow you to eat you out of house and home, that gets frustrating and tempers rise. Relationships broke down. And so you have intact families that are no longer intact. And whatever way they became not intact and whatever that arguing and fighting and everything that now kids were just present for because they weren't at school has all happened via this pandemic. I think, for us, we saw really a mental health crisis during the pandemic. We really ramped up our behavioral health services here at Flight Center, for example, that were available both in person and virtually. And it was a literal crisis. And when I say crisis, it's not just ongoing mental health that was needed. We really needed to focus on crisis intervention and being able to de-escalate in that moment, because not only are people experiencing the crisis of what the pandemic is doing financially to families and to folks, and relationship wise within households, but then you had families losing people, right? Because the pandemic held no hostages, right? It wasn't, it kind of swept whoever it was sweeping out, and people are now also going through grief and loss and all of these different kinds of things. So, you know, without an outlet to be able to express some of that grief, without an outlet to be able to express some of those things in a safe place. So, I mean, for our young people, it just was wild, to be honest with you. The amount of services that we had to pump in to ramp up to be able to support our young people. We had a lot of youth from foster care who had aged beyond like the scope of the system, who came back into our doors at 26, 27, because we were the last system that they belonged to, right? The last system of care that they belonged to was foster care. And they came back for help because this is the family that they come back to. And our system has a setup where it's like, okay, well, you've aged out. And at Flight Center, we were like, no, if this is the family that they've known, they're going to come back to the family that they've known. And it's hard pressed to tell a young person that, you know, we're your family, but only to a certain age. So we had to really push those boundaries with even some of our donors to say, we need you to think outside of the box here with us. Where else are they going to go to for help? We can send them to some of these adult systems, but this is not what they're used to interfacing with. This is not the family that we supposedly have set up for them. And this family turn each other away. So, I mean, I think the pandemic brought up so many, you know, concerns beyond health concerns. But that mental health piece just was rampant as people were trying to deal with grief and deal with where they belong in the world and whatever was going on in their household that they were, you know, trapped in together. People, you know, unfortunately, we were going through the pandemic and some political things all at the same time. And honestly, for some of our young people, it was difficult for them to manage the feelings, the losses and the pressures of the pandemic on top of some of the political things that were going on at that time as well, and feeling very daunted by the political state of our nation, and feeling like they were learning things about people around them that they thought were allies that now they learned were not. And so there was just a lot during these last few years that has come up for our young people and our BIPOC students, you know, in particular. It's been just a very trying, you know, few years all across the board.
Thank you. And just as a follow-up, I find it interesting how you said, you know, you had to pump in a lot to get more out because of how the pandemic impacted you all. And then I'm sure with the influx of people who aged out that were coming back, what support or resources were you given or afforded to be able to do that work and increase your team's capacity to support the additional, I guess, the additional clients or, I guess, young people that came back when you all were what they saw as their resource at the time?
So for Flight Center, I mean, I'll tell you that I'm very vocal, very Puerto Rican when it comes to what our needs are. I'm very like, this is what we need, and I really make that known. And I say that because you have to, the squeaky wheel gets the oil to a degree, right? And I had to be very vocal about what it would take in Broward County to uphold our system of care. And Flight being the lead of our system of care here for youth aging out of foster care, I had to let them know that from soup to nuts as an organization, if we're really being honest with ourselves, we couldn't just support those youth who are actively in care, but we needed to be prepared to not only uphold the youth that would be coming back in, those young adults, 26, 27 years old, we also needed to help our frontline staff members, because in Broward County, over 50% of youth are living, 50% of Broward County is living, you know, on the poverty line, one paycheck away from disaster. And these are frontline people. And for our standpoint, we said, if the social workers start to fall, right, the whole infrastructure of the whole thing starts to fall. Who's going to be here for uplift these young people if our staff is not also uplifted? So I did have to challenge some of our private donors and funders with that. Like, if you're going to grant us some dollars, please give us maximum flexibility of what we're going to be able to do, because we're going to be seeing situations that are coming that we've never seen before. We're going to be seeing a new trend rising that we never have seen before, and we need to be able to react quickly. I think the benefit for us is that we're not very bureaucratic. if I say go, we go. And so we're able to remove some of those confines of like, is this, grant this and that. And I was very honest with donors. The other thing is that we're very savvy when it comes to grant writing. And I'm being very honest with that because there wasn't a lot of opportunity to fundraise, right? You can't go to an event and host an event and do a gala, all these other creative ways to get like unrestricted dollars. We had to really look at what grant opportunities were out there that were in avenues like behavioral health that might have been things that we relied on partnering agencies for that we now needed to bring in-house because our partners were inundated. They didn't have capacities to serve the needs and fill those gaps. So we had to kind of pivot and look at what we needed and not be afraid to step out and say, okay, we have this trend and now we need to fill it. So we did write some, creative grants surrounding mental health. We were careful to request for those dollars to be in those areas of critical need and be crisis based so that it wasn't just units based. And if you're Medicaid or not Medicaid, we had to kind of be honest with people about the fact that we need dollars now to serve on the front line right now. So the way that I explain it to people is like an emergency room, right? We are the triage unit. We need to be able to triage these young people and then bridge them over to maybe longer term services and do that warm handoff. So we're not looking to supplant what other people are doing, but we definitely need to be a full operating emergency room with all hands on deck. So we kind of pull things together. I mean, honestly, we ran through a truckload of reserves as well. I mean, and these are all just candid. I'm a very transparent person. These are issues and struggles that nonprofits face. They ran through reserves. They use their PPP money creatively. Hopefully you were using it in the right way and not to line your own pockets. You were hiring staff with some of that money to help fill in gaps. And so those are the ways that we survived, and we're coming out on the other side of that. We have to do a truckload of fundraising now to replace some of those reserves and all of those different things, but we kept our system of care intact. And that was the frontmost mission that we had as an organization, was to make sure that the system and our youth and those who were coming back did not just go by the wayside.
Thank you for that. And also echoing the sentiments in the chat, thank you for the work that you are doing to keep that standard of care there, and even bringing back those who have aged out of foster care, knowing that you all were their first point of contact with everything that went on in the world over the last 2 years and continues to happen, that you all were able to be there for them as well. Orlando, I saw your hand raised. I want to give you a chance to respond to this question as well.
Yeah, when I was speaking earlier, I just wanted to talk about some of the things that policymakers can do to support the foster care families. One of them is to continue to support social workers, continue to put money into hiring more social workers, especially in the school system. I know some of the rural counties here in North Carolina, a social worker may have to cover 15 or 20 different schools because the county can only afford to have 1 or 2 social workers in that county. I happen to be in one of the more affluent counties, and even here, we still have a shortfall of social workers. We don't have enough that each school can have one. Sometimes a social worker might have 3 schools, which doesn't sound like a lot, but if it's a high need school, it can be extremely difficult to cover those schools and the students that are in those schools to give them the things that they need. So just increasing the number of social workers across the board. And then the big one for Black and Brown families, I think, is for the policymakers in each state, county, however, whatever level you want to look at, is to set aside or try to make a conscious effort to invest in affordable housing. Because right now, the number of families that are becoming homeless on a daily basis is just a crazy number. And families are being forced out. We're no longer under the moratorium where you can't evict. And so now families are being evicted. Families are on the street that never thought they would be on the street because one, they may have lost a job or lost a vehicle and they can't get to work. And now they miss a paycheck and now they're out on the street. And so now these students, depending on the age, may be placed in foster, because I know it's some of the shelters, for example, a male student that's above the age of 13 won't be placed in some of the shelters where they're male and female students or children So the 13-year-old will have to be placed in an adult facility or some other arrangement made, which may mean that child ends up in foster. So there's a lot of things that could be coming just because of the economic downfall that we've had. And now housing is at a premium, and there's just not enough affordable housing options in most areas, especially most metropolitan areas that are rapidly growing and pushing, the low income Black and brown families further and further out. And so they're losing housing at an alarming rate. And I think that's going to contribute to a lot of students ending up in foster.
Latasha, I see your hand raised, so I'd love for you to provide us an answer or response to this as well.
Yeah, so I agree with everything Orlando is saying. And to add on to what he's saying, I think it is very important that not only just social workers, but making sure that we have clinical psychologists as well on staff who are trained in mental health crises in various situations. As he was mentioning, there are very few clinical staff on hand to be able to address any of these issues. For some schools, you only have one. And as he mentioned, for multiple schools, you have one trying to address these stresses and issues, mental health issues for many of these students. I think also in addition to that, we want to make sure that the clinical staff is properly trained, like they have the training that they need to be able to address the needs of our Black and brown students. We want to make sure that the staff is, the training includes cultural sensitivity and awareness. We also want to acknowledge that there are many biases towards children and families of color. So we want to make sure that the students and the families of color are receiving adequate services. And I think it would also be beneficial if the clinical staff were building connections with our community resources who firsthand have the support and are inclusive of the child's cultural identity and experiences as well.
And it's so interesting that you think about like the clinical staff and the additional trauma, but just like the resources as we think about how what happens in the schools is so impacted by all things, the housing crisis and the shortage there. When we think about the funding for organizations that Christine alluded to. And so as I often think about kind of the combination of the expertise that all three of you bring to this conversation, it's really important to realize that there's no one size fits all into the solutions of these, that there really has to be a sense of community there to help support these families and these young people. And while we are specifically mentioning race as it relates to this, there's also those other cultural identities that are nuanced. So whether they're families of immigrants, whether they are being raised by older siblings and family structure, but as we think about LGBTQ youth and the work that has to happen there to ensure in times of being displaced, that they are in places that are safe and that will also support their identity and their growth and development in ways that speaks to them living their truth as well. And so I really appreciate you all here today. Our last question, here at the Hunt Institute, we are so excited to be a part of a steering committee of 8 other organizations that work with educator diversity. And so we're happy to lead our 1 Million Teachers of Color work. And along the line of what you all have mentioned about schools, I'd love for you all to quickly just give an insight into how does the lack of teacher and school leader diversity play into the support and resources that children in foster care or children experiencing a mental health crisis need? How does that lack of, I guess, intentionality in recruiting and retaining teachers and leaders of color really impact those students and also impact the work you're able to do? We'll start with Tasha and then we'll go to Christine and we'll end with Orlando.
Yeah, so I think that when we're hiring the clinical staff and the teachers, we want to think about not only what they're being taught in the schools, but their experiences as well. If these clinical staff and the teachers are able to firsthand identify and be able to relate to many of the experiences that the students are experiencing, I believe that they are able to provide greater treatment. As we mentioned before, there's biases that occur. We mentioned the fact that I think a landlord mentioned that what is it that I'm looking for? What is the word? Well, the main thing I would say is just making sure that we have the experienced clinicians on staff to be able to provide the treatment that the students need, and being able to connect them with resources that are in the community, and addressing the biases as well.
Thank you.
I echo what Latasha has said. Obviously, training goes a far way, and lived experience goes a far way as well, right? And you have a lot of folks who come from all walks of life that have many different lived experiences that are applicable and able to be related to young people. I always say in social work, when we were doing our masters, I was like, you had the natural born ones, and you had the ones that no matter how much they were trained, you couldn't train the social work into them, right? Because you just have some folks who are naturally able to connect to people, and some who are just off-putting naturally, right? But it certainly is nice for our young people. I mean, we make sure that we keep a diverse staff. I think that it's important for our young people to have representation across professions, and have folks that they feel that they can connect with, that look and feel like them. To Latasha's point, also folks who have similar lived experiences as them, because they'll be able to see that there's kind of, the other side of things, where they can get to, at some point in life, and all of these different things. But I think representation is huge. I also think as a community, we need to have more value for our Black and Brown professionals as well. And I think that's part of the epidemic that we're seeing, is that, and not just, Black and Brown professionals, but across professions that are really the caretaking professions, the teaching profession, the mental health profession, and social work profession, and all of those things that are really upholding our community. There's been such a devaluing of those jobs historically, and I think people are just tired of it. Those professionals are tired of it. I think as professionals, people want to be paid what they're worth, and traditionally, these are the fields where people have not been paid what they're worth. Their jobs are looked at more as like, you are, a volunteer, and this is your good deed, and like, you don't have a family to support. And I think that there's pushback from educators and social workers and mental health professionals who are tired of only being written off and saying, hey, well, you're in this to do some good as well. Yes, I am. I care about my work. I'm in this to do some good. I also have to raise my family. I also have needs that I need to attend to, and I can't be in crisis because my work value is not at the forefront. I can't put myself in crisis and then expect to help manage our community's crises. And I think that's, part of the conversation that needs to be had. Because then it's very difficult for within our Black and Brown communities, with some of the crises that our Black and Brown communities are facing, to have teachers go in that are making nothing. Why would you want to work in the profession? And hence, why would there be representation for our young people to look up to, of young Black and Brown professionals, when we're not giving them any way to be able to support their own families and keep themselves out of crisis, never mind keep our youth out of crisis. I'll stop there, because I can go on about this all day. You can see I'm very passionate about it, but overall, representation matters. And I think that we really just need to have a higher value for those folks who are really weaving our society together and keeping it together.
And we'll have our last response from Orlando before we wrap it up today.
All right. Well, I think one of the alarming things that I see on a daily basis is that when you are a young Black or Brown child walking into a school, you don't always see someone that looks like you, whether that be a boy or girl. And I know for me, at the school that I'm at, I can count on one hand the number of Black and Brown educators. And in the county that I'm in, I can count on two hands how many male social workers there are. And so it's a rarity to have a Black or Brown male social worker in the building. And we all know that historically, we have better outcomes when there's someone that looks like you, that thinks like you, that's grown up like you and had some similarities, and invest the time, because they a lot of times see themselves in this little child that's somehow drifting. And so I think when you have a person of color in the classroom, or as an administrator, or as a social worker, or as a cafeteria worker that has a vested interest in a Black or brown child, you have better outcomes. I talk to teachers, the few Black and brown teachers at the school that I work at, and a lot of the behavior problems aren't experienced in the Black male teachers' classes that are experienced in some of the other classes. Why is that? Because of the role of the Black male in the Black community. So they don't tolerate it. So the kids don't even go there with it. So just having someone that looks like a kid, that may be a kid that kind of has a few bumps in the road, but that one person that looks like them that can kind of get them to understand that there's a bigger world out here other than just this middle school or this high school or this elementary school or your neighborhood or your block, just to get them to understand that there's so much more out here that you could be doing. I believe in you. I love you. You're beautiful. All the things that they may not be hearing on a regular basis. And so when all you do is you're the troublemaker, you're the troublemaker, you're the troublemaker, eventually you start to believe I'm the troublemaker. So we have to take a different approach. We try to recruit, intentional about your recruiting when you're hiring new staff, to get staff that looks like your demographics in your school. Not to say all Black or all white, but have a little bit of everything in there, a melting pot, so to speak. And then do some of the cultural competencies for the staff training when we bring on new staff. So everyone's aware, this is our demographic here. This is where we have some of our problems, where we're spending most of our time. Don't push the trouble kid aside, spend some time with them instead. Build relationship, build community, do the things that you should be doing anyway, but just make a conscious effort to do that. And I think as you see someone that looks like you and talks like you and is from a similar background as you tend to have a better outcome with some of the youth in these elementary, middle, high schools, just because you can relate. And not to say that if you're not from that environment, you can't relate. But again, it's about just seeing someone that's like you, that you can ask a question. A lot of times kids are afraid to ask someone that doesn't look like them a question. They don't want to be singled out already. They're struggling academically. So now, why would I ask this teacher? They don't care about me. So just building community, showing kids that you care, and then having someone that looks like you that you feel you can confide in, and then having a safe place. And I think it would benefit, so many of our Black and brown kids to have that. And then the language barrier, because a lot of my brown kid population, the Hispanic kids that don't speak English, and this is their first time in the US at a school, and there's few, we have a immersion program where basically we sit kids in a classroom other than one class a day that speak their language. So now you have to learn the language by sitting in a classroom, listening to the language. I don't know how effective that is, but that's the program, that's the system that we have currently in place. And so we have some brown kids that are at a disadvantage because of language. And so we have to address these things and continue to recruit people that look like the students that are in our schools. And I'll stop there.
Well, thank you all for the insights you've shared. I have definitely learned a lot from this conversation, especially about the role that you all play around foster care, families, and especially the mental health and support of students. So hopefully our participants were able to engage and learn. This will be posted on our YouTube site for people to share and replay. I've included our link for additional Hunt opportunities to engage in our virtual webinar series. We have all across our content team, so early childhood, K-12, our post-secondary team and our equity initiatives team, we have webinars monthly. So there's about 4 to 6 webinars a month that provide insight into equitable educational policy across the continuum. I'm so excited to have our panelists. Thank you all so much for spending this time with us today and sharing your expertise with us. Really appreciate you being in this space and the work that you do to advocate for youth and resources. That will be all for today. I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of the week and a wonderful weekend. Thank you.